All right, everybody, I'm going to add a couple details to the electrical properties of the heart. If you've watched the prior videos, you've been introduced to the electrical conduction system of the heart, mainly under control of the parasympathetic nervous system, squirting out acetylcholine, which binds to muscarinic type 2 receptors on the sinoatrial node and the AV node. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system would squirt out norepinephrine onto those nodes, but also to the majority of the myocardium, and it would bind to beta 1 receptors. So we should know that this wave of conduction will spread first through these nervous pathways, so from the SA node through these internodal pathways, getting atrial contraction, and then eventually spreading to the AV bundle, which controls the contraction of the ventricles. So atria contract and then the ventricles. And then we'll see this wave of excitation go through the AV bundle, down the left and right bundle branches, and then up through the Purkinje fibers, so that the contraction is first atria and then the ventricles in an upward fashion to eject the blood out through the aorta and through the pulmonary vessels. Also remember that cardiac myocytes are excitable cells, which means they can generate action potentials. Action, again, is whatever that cell's job is, and potential is charge. So they can complete their action when they reach a specific charge. And once that charge is reached, that means that these excitable cells can turn on. So here we have the SA node. It's being stimulated by some sort of current nerve, and the electrical current is going to spread from the node through the contractile myocardial cells, which are connected via specialized gap junctions, so that we have this spread of excitation from the node and then down these syncytial cells so that they work together as a sheet. So one by one, we'll see this wave of contraction spread. And we can measure that wave of contraction by looking at the readout of the charge of those cells' membranes. The more excitable they are, the higher the charge. Okay, this is just another picture of the intercalated discs. We have our specialized gap junctions here, which can allow the free movement of ions between cells. The specialized sarcoplasmic reticulum, storing intracellular calcium, and our cardiac myofibril with our actin and myosin cross bridges. So the calcium can be liberated, come down the little T-tubule, and then enhance the strength of contraction and the sliding of those filaments together. So that leads us to the cardiac action potential. There's two types of action potentials generated by the heart. There are the muscle cells themselves, the myocytes, and then we have the nodal fibers. So first, we'll look at the one that people are probably more familiar with. This is the fast response type of action potential. You will see this in the myocytes, and this is going to involve a period of depolarization and a prolonged depolarization, and then a repolarization, and then the movement of positive ions in and then out of the cell. The slow response has some of the same capabilities here. So we're going to see the entrance of sodium, the entrance of calcium, the exit of potassium. But this happens in the nodes because those fibers in the nodes are more similar to the endocardium, a smooth connective tissue, rather than the muscle cells that make up the myocardium. So we'll start with the fast response, and there is a little extra curve on the cardiac cell action potential, where in muscle we see depolarization and repolarization. Same thing with nervous tissue. But depolarization, we have the entry of sodium into a cell or a fiber, and then repolarization, we see the the cell spitting out its ion that's in highest concentration inside, which is potassium. So here is a myocyte at rest. That's its resting potential. That is when the concentration of ions in and outside of the membrane are in perfect harmony and that cell is not doing anything. First, we have this depolarization or rising phase, which will be predominated by the entry of sodium into the cell. Sodium is a positive ion, so that's going to drive up the charge. It will remove the polarization, remove the negativity. Then we will see a second phase, which happens right after the cell decides that it doesn't want to do anything. And that is when it snaps open its potassium channels that are voltage gated. So once we get to this really, really high voltage up here, the cell's like, that was fun, but let's not do anything anymore, and snaps open its potassium channels. Potassium's a positive ion, so when you lose a positive ion, you'll start to see the charge go down. However, at the same time, not only do we have potassium channels opening, we also have calcium channels opening. And calcium, which we know is really high in the extracellular fluid in the cardiac area, we also know calcium can induce more calcium release from the sarcoplastic reticulum. So the calcium is going to then drive itself into the cell down its concentration gradient. Calcium is also a positive ion, so that leads to the next phase, which we call either plateau or prolonged depolarization. The cell's already depolarized, it's already positive, we're just making that go on for longer now thanks to calcium. And then all this time, the cell has been trying to just go back to sleep, like you on a Sunday morning, definitely me, putting the pillow over its head, spitting out its potassium, to go and repolarize, return to rest. So essentially we're going to have the entry of sodium, entry of calcium, and then the exiting of potassium until we get back to rest. So there's one extra ion involved, and it's calcium. And calcium we know is really, really important with determining strength of contraction. So here are our phases. We have rest, we have depolarization, we have the potassium channels opening, we have plateau, we have repolarization, and we have rest. Depolarization, it's also referred to as the upstroke. Early partial repolarization, what a great name. The cell's like, no thanks, I would like to go to sleep. I'm opening up my potassium channels, so there. And then calcium comes by and is like, no, you will not go rest. We will contract. Stage 3 is repolarization, and stage 4 is back to rest. So 4 is resting, then 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Depolarization is sodium in. Make sure you remember these. Sodium in, sodium, that looks good. 1 is potassium out, 2 is calcium in, and then 3 is the continuing of potassium leaving the cell. And then we're back at resting. And hopefully there's enough time for repolarization here so that we don't have early premature contractions. All right, and that period that we refer to with we do not want relative or new contractions, that's our refractory period. That's when the cell is quiescent, it is resting, and it is physiologically the heart is filling at this time. So we need to have ideally a nice long refractory period. This is a slide showing you which ions are moving in and out during these phases, 0 through 4. We have inward currents and we have outward currents. All right, so sodium in, potassium out. We also have chloride out. Chloride travels with sodium like a tail of a dog. Calcium in, potassium out, and at 4, we should only have our potassium leak channels open. So this is a good slide for memorization of which ions are moving in what direction. This is another way of looking at this. So here we have the different steps of the cardiac action potential, and we have which channels are open. So at 0, our initial depolarization, we have sodium coming in, making this negative environment more positive. One, potassium channels snap open, so potassium is leaving, so we're having some loss of positivity. And then 2, we still have potassium leaving, but now calcium's coming in to make things even more positive. In 3, we start to see potassium just leaving, the inside of the cell becoming more negative. And then at resting, we're always going to see potassium leak channels open so that we have regulation of the cell's internal environment. That's really all it can control, so that's what it does. They're always open. It's like an overflow to make sure there's not too little or too much potassium. Here's another picture showing you what channels are open. At rest, the channels open are our potassium leaks. That's it. Sodium is closed, calcium is closed. However, at depolarization, when we get to positive 10 millivolts, that is the voltage necessary to cause these sodium and calcium channels to open during depolarization. Okay, the slow response in the nodes still involves the same relative movement of ions. You might see, though, we're missing a couple of steps. We're going from 4, which is our resting, our 3, which is repolarization, and then our 0, which was really sodium entry. So depolarization, repolarization, and resting. Node fibers are leaky to sodium and calcium, so whenever you have an influx of them, it raises the potential of that cell, making it more likely that that cell will generate its own action potential. So here is node action potentials. So we can see that we have potassium in, and then phase 0, we see mainly the movement of calcium in. And then repolarization is potassium out. In phase 4, as we mentioned, there's permeability to both sodium and calcium. So that's what we call a more transient type of entry, where it's not such a strong, like, immediate upward tick for depolarization. It's just a gentle, like, hey, I'm permeable to you, I'm calcium, come on in. So this is what things look like in the nodes, and these are pacemaker cells, meaning that it is way easier for them to generate their own action potential because their threshold potential is lower than other cells. It's actually lower than the resting potential. So that just means a little bit of calcium needs to get in, for example, and you'll start to see the pacemaker cell turn on. That's the mechanism by which you can see the turtle hearts outside of the body beating for 20 minutes after death. As long as there's extracellular calcium in the fluid, then we can have firing of these nodal cells. So here's just going through the difference of them between the fast response and the myocytes and slow response. Fast, faster velocity. They go faster velocity. The resting is negative 90, and the threshold, so that's the point, if you don't remember threshold potential. Threshold potential are the point at which voltage-gated channels open. So, voltage-gated channels, they open when that cell gets to a certain charge. Maybe it's 10. Here, it's negative 65. So if this cell is sitting at negative 90, when we get to negative 65, all the voltage-gated channels open, and that's going to drive up the depolarization. So cells here, they're also not excitable until there's full repolarization. The Na channels have to reset, they have to close again, which means that they can't contract constantly. And if you did, you'd have ventricular fibrillation, and you might die if they don't bring out the crash cart. Relatively short refractory period, though, so that we have a beat. Yeah, if it's 60 beats a minute, that's once a second. Okay, in the nodes, though, we have slower velocity. The resting is about negative 55 to negative 60, where the threshold is negative 40. So that means it's really, really close to the threshold. So you just need a little bit of calcium in during that first phase where it's permeable to both, and then everything will snap open and it will go repolarize. Nice long refractory period, not a short one. Whoa. Okay, this is what we see when we overlay them together. We have the node resting potential in quotation marks because it's not really resting, it's kind of sitting at its threshold, being permeable to both calcium and sodium. So this is the overlaid SA fibers, and then we have the fast twitch muscle. So what you're looking at is a little bit of a lag where the node becomes excited or depolarized, and that leads to the myocyte contracting. So this only takes a couple of seconds. You're essentially looking at a heartbeat here, just with action potentials. So that's what they do. The action potential generates the contractile force. So think of the action potential as you stretching a rubber band or stretching something so that you can let it go. So it's getting all primed up so that you're building the force in order for there to be contraction. And this is the pathway that we keep talking about. So when we have the excitation of the SA node, it'll generate one of those slow action potentials, and then we have those ions spreading throughout the myocytes through the gap junctions, exciting one fiber at a time so that we get this nice wave of excitation. SA node, AV node, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. This is an outline of all of those pieces. So SA node, that's our pacemaker. That sets the resting heart rate. The AV node is going to control the contraction of the ventricles. And then the entire pathway is here. You can click on this to go to a live link in your PowerPoint as well. But we have SA node, conducting network, atrial muscle cells, they contract. Then that spreads the AV node, then the bundle of His, or sometimes they call that the AV bundle, to the Purkinje fibers, which then spread out to the ventricular muscles so that they contract. So we have the constant stimulation of these pacemaker cells spreading out their depolarization through this conducting network. And that, my friends, is how the heart works.